More than 400 million people worldwide rely on Ukrainian grains, and together, Russia and Ukraine export nearly a third of the world's wheat, barley, and more than 70% of the sunflower oil. As the pandemic wasn't enough, the war made the world food prices skyrocket by preventing some 20 million tons of Ukrainian grain from reaching the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of Asia. Up to 181 million people in 41 countries could face a food crisis or even outright famine, but the economic consequences of this war are far from over. Even before the war, the world's food supply was really bad. Drought affected wheat and vegetable oil crops in Canada last year, and corn and soybean yields in South America. COVID had a big impact too. In Indonesia and Malaysia, labor shortages meant lower harvests of palm oil, which pushed up vegetable oil prices globally. At the beginning of this year, the price of many of the world's staple foods was reaching all-time highs. Many hoped that crops from Ukraine could help make up the global shortfall, but Russia's invasion has prevented that. The Ukrainian Agriculture Ministry says 20 million tons of grain are now stuck in the country. Before the war, 90% of Ukraine's exports were left via deep ports in the Black Sea, which can load tankers large enough to travel long distances, like China or India, and still make a profit. But all are now closed. Russia has seized most of Ukraine's coastline and blockaded the rest. The main route out of the country now is rail, but Ukraine's rail system is wider than the EU's, which means loads have to be transferred to new wagons at the border. The average waiting time is 16 days, but it can take up to 30. Though the global conversation around food shortages is largely about wheat, most of the grain leaving Ukraine at the moment is corn. And that is for two reasons, according to Alina Naroba, Ukrainian grain analyst at the brokerage Maxigrain. She believes Ukrainian farmers are hesitant to sell wheat because they are haunted by the memory of the Holodomor, a famine created by Stalin in 1932 in which millions of Ukrainians died. Corn, on the other hand, is not as widely eaten in Ukraine. The other factor, she says, is demand. Europe doesn't buy much Ukrainian wheat, it's self-sufficient. And it's difficult to move this wheat on beyond the EU, as ports in Poland and Romania are not equipped to export large volumes of grain. Some countries depend heavily on these exports. Right now, Lebanon imports 80% of its wheat from Ukraine, and India 76% of its sunflower oil. A special crisis task force is monitoring more than 60 countries that are struggling to pay for food imports. High energy prices and volatility in the food markets have put extra pressure on cash-strapped developing countries. As more people grow hungry globally, the United Nations' goal to end hunger by the end of the decade looks further than ever. Drought is gripping the Horn of Africa, leaving some 26 million people facing food shortages in Kenya, Ethiopia, and Somalia over the next 6 months. Across East Africa as a whole, some 50 million people are facing acute food insecurity. In Lebanon, food inflation has been running at 122%. Domestic food price inflation is high in almost all low and middle-income countries. That means it's difficult for people to afford food even in places where there isn't a shortage. People are paying more for necessities everywhere from Peru to Burundi. According to the World Food Programme, a record high of 49 million people in 46 countries could fall into famine or famine-like conditions. The worst affected countries are Ethiopia, Nigeria, South Sudan, Afghanistan, Somalia, and Yemen, where there are 750,000 people facing starvation and death, of which 400,000 alone are in Ethiopia's Tigray region, where there is an ongoing civil war. Low foreign exchange reserves made it difficult for Sri Lanka to import food. The ousted government sought to improve its balance of payments crisis by banning the import of fertilizer, which, coupled with an outright ban on using them, led to the destruction of half the country's rice crop. A country's financial health depends on the flow of money through it. When there are problems with exports, that means less money in the country's economy, and there will be less money available for other uses such as investment or government spending. The same thing happens when there are problems with imports. If trade restrictions raise the price of goods, consumers will find it harder to afford them, so they'll spend less money on other things that require imports, such as food and clothing. And if companies can't export their goods because their suppliers have been restricted from selling abroad, then they won't be able to sell them at all, which means even more people will be out of work and even less money will be available for investment and government spending. Economies with strong trade, financial, and migration links to Russia and Ukraine could suffer the greatest immediate harm, the World Bank says. But the food crisis is not the only consequence of this war. The world is facing huge problems when it comes to energy supply. Despite decades of calls to reduce dependency on fossil fuels, countries have persisted in the widespread use of coal, oil, and gas to fuel their economies. Not only has the burning of fossil fuels been responsible for rising carbon emissions that drive global heating, but we have created a globalized world in which food and energy systems are highly concentrated, which makes them extremely vulnerable to disruption. The war in Ukraine has shown us how the lack of diversity in our global energy and food systems is working against the resilience of livelihoods. As the prices for energy, fertilizer, and food commodities skyrocket, people across the planet are unable to absorb the rising costs. Our collective failure to promote diversified energy systems has forced millions around the world to become dependent on humanitarian aid to meet their basic survival needs. Even before the current energy crisis began, the world was falling short in ensuring equitable access to energy for all. 770 million people lack access to electricity worldwide, which precludes efforts to achieve poverty eradication and other development goals. At the same time, approximately 2.5 billion people lack access to clean cooking, meaning nearly 1/3 of the global population still depends on firewood and charcoal for cooking their meals. This leads to negative health consequences, disproportionately threatening the safety and well-being of people. It also contributes to deforestation and resource scarcity, which can trigger social tensions. As political negotiations ensue and initiatives convene to unlock solutions to the current crisis, preventing further aggravation and transforming systems to withstand future shocks requires a forward outlook. Instead, we see countries reacting to the energy crisis by reneging on their climate commitments and reverting to fossil fuels. As a result, global cooperation to advance climate action is under threat at a time when such commitments are crucial. Such diversification entails transitioning to the use of low-carbon and fuel-efficient technologies across food systems in pursuit of global targets to achieve net zero emissions by mid-century. In this context, it is imperative to promote the use of renewable energy sources such as solar, hydro, and wind, and to close the gap in energy access in developing countries. Europe is not an exception to these economic problems. Russia supplied the EU with 40% of its natural gas last year. Germany, Europe's largest economy, was the largest importer in 2021, followed by Italy. Since February, the EU has imposed several sanction packages on Russia, including on its energy industry. The Kremlin has said that technological problems caused by Western sanctions are preventing Russia from supplying gas via the Nord Stream pipeline. Due to the rapid increase in gas prices, the EU has proposed a price cap on Russian gas. President Putin has threatened to cut off all energy supplies if it takes such a step. The EU has also said it will cut gas imports from Russia by 2/3 within a year, but has stopped short of a total ban. To help it reach its goal, member states have agreed to cut gas usage by 15% over the next 7 months. There's doubt over where the EU will find alternative supplies, and it may need to ship liquefied natural gas in tankers from producers like the US and Qatar, but it will be a real challenge because there aren't enough LNG terminals in Europe. This will be a problem for Germany, particularly. The EU has agreed to ban all Russian oil imports which come in by sea by the end of this year. It will allow oil to continue to be imported by pipeline as a temporary measure because countries like Hungary and Slovakia depend on it. Some European nations could still have their oil supplies significantly squeezed by the ban. Lithuania and Finland got about 80% of their oil from Russia in November last year. However, EU countries can buy oil from other producers. Earlier this year, the International Energy Agency, a club of oil importing countries, agreed to release 120 million barrels worth of oil from their stocks, and President Biden ordered a major release of oil from America's reserves. The US has declared a complete ban on Russian oil imports, and the volume of oil imports by the UK has fallen sharply in the last year. Helped by soaring energy prices, Russia received an estimated 400 billion euros over the past year from oil and gas exports to Europe. The EU says its latest sanctions could cut the amount of oil it buys from Russia by 90%. However, this will take months to come into full effect, and even then Russia will be able to sell oil elsewhere in the world. India and China have both been buying more Russian oil in recent months. Furthermore, countries are feeling the pinch because they're dependent on energy imported from other countries. In addition, these countries are also stuck in debt to petroleum companies as they import fuel for their vehicles. While these countries suffer, those with enough oil and gas resources to sustain their economic growth prosper. Energy crises have contributed to the existing problems by aggravating them. For example, decreased economic growth causes further energy deprivations as consumers have less money to spend on unnecessary goods and services. In addition, increased economic growth causes more air, land, and water pollution due to increased vehicles running on fossil fuels. The increasing inflation causes more people to seek out black market fuel in hopes of profiting from higher prices. As a result, many countries deal with both economic damage and social issues stemming from low fuel availability. Unfortunately, there's still a lot of controversy about how to address the global energy crisis. Some argue that reducing global oil consumption is the best course of action. This strategy is supported by the fact that many countries are currently suffering from low oil production. However, this plan ignores how harmful oil scarcity can be when it falls at the wrong time for global economies. Because of these issues surrounding the global energy crisis, it is very uncertain how things will evolve in the future and what solutions governments will come up with to solve these problems. But we know a thing: the conflict affected the lives of Ukrainians, as well as the lives of millions of other people all around the world. If you liked this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, because other episodes will come soon. Until next time, take care of yourself. Peace.